Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. On the morning of October 7th, 2003, something happened inside the assembly hall of St. Mary's International School in Bangkok that no one who witnessed it would ever fully explain. It began during morning prayers, a routine gathering where 400 girls stood in neat rows beneath ceiling fans that turned slowly in the humid air. The first scream cut through the recitation like a blade, sharp and sudden, coming from somewhere near the back. Then another girl collapsed, her body hitting the polished floor with a sound that echoed across the hall. Within minutes, dozens more were on the ground, convulsing, their voices rising in unison, but speaking in tones that did not belong to teenage girls. The sounds were deep, layered, overlapping, as if multiple voices were emerging from single throats. Teachers rushed forward but hesitated when they heard what the voices were saying. They were not random words or incoherent shouts. They were warnings, specific and deliberate, about something buried beneath the very floor where the girls had fallen. St. Mary's International School had stood in the Sukhumvit district of Bangkok for nearly 60 years, a compound of cream-colored buildings surrounded by high walls and old rain trees that cast long shadows across the courtyards. It was known for its discipline, its academic rigor, and the kind of quiet respectability that appealed to families seeking structure and tradition. The girls who attended wore crisp white blouses and navy skirts, their hair tied back neatly, their shoes polished every morning. The school had a rhythm, a predictability, and nothing about it suggested the chaos that would unfold that October. The assembly hall, where morning prayers were held, was the largest room on campus, a rectangular space with tall windows along both sides, and a stage at the front where the school's principal, Sister Agnes, would stand and lead the daily recitation. The floors were made of dark teak wood, polished to a high shine, and the walls were lined with framed photographs of graduating classes dating back to the 1950s. It was a place of order, of routine, of voices blending together in rehearsed prayer. But on that particular morning, the air inside the hall felt different. Several teachers would later mention it, the way the humidity seemed heavier than usual, the way the ceiling fans seemed to labor more slowly, as if something unseen was pressing down on the room. The girls filed in as they always did, forming rows that stretched from the stage to the back wall. Sister Agnes stood at the front, her hands clasped in front of her, waiting for silence. The prayers began just after 8 in the morning, a familiar sequence of verses that the girls knew by heart. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded as it always had. Then, without warning, a girl named Ploy, a 14-year-old standing in the 4th row, let out a scream that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed sideways, her body rigid. 2 girls near her stumbled backward, and before anyone could reach Ploy, another girl near the front dropped to her knees, her hands clawing at the floor. Within seconds, it spread. Girls began falling in clusters, their bodies jerking, their limbs twisting in ways that looked unnatural. The hall erupted into shouts and confusion. Teachers moved through the rows, trying to lift the girls, trying to calm them, but the voices that emerged from their mouths stopped everyone cold. They were not the voices of children. They were deep, guttural, layered with harmonics that seemed impossible for a single person to produce. Some spoke in Thai, others in dialects that no one in the room recognized. But the words that cut through most clearly, repeated again and again by different girls, were these: Something was buried beneath the hall, something that had been disturbed, something that wanted to be acknowledged. Sister Agnes, a woman in her 60s who had spent her entire adult life in the calm structure of religious education, stood frozen at the front of the hall. She had seen illness before, seen students faint from heat or exhaustion, but this was different. The synchronized nature of the collapses, the voices, the way the girls seemed to be speaking with knowledge they should not possess, all of it defied any rational explanation she could grasp. She called for the school nurse, for water, for someone to open the windows wider, but her voice was drowned out by the rising chaos. Parents were called. Ambulances arrived. By midday, nearly 40 girls had been taken to nearby hospitals, and the hall had been evacuated. Doctors found nothing physically wrong with any of them. No fever, no signs of poisoning, no indication of illness. Yet the girls remained in states of semi-consciousness, some still murmuring in those deep, overlapping voices, others staring blankly at the ceiling as if seeing something no one else could. By the time evening fell, word of what had happened at St. Mary's had spread through Bangkok like wildfire. Parents gathered outside the school gates, demanding answers. The media arrived, cameras rolling, reporters pressing microphones toward anyone who would speak. Sister Agnes released a statement, calling it a medical incident, possibly mass hysteria triggered by stress or heat. But even as she spoke, her voice wavered. The truth was, no one knew what had happened, and the explanations being offered felt hollow. That night, the school administration made the decision to bring in a team of monks from a nearby temple, a group known for performing cleansing rituals in places believed to be spiritually troubled. The monks arrived just after midnight, dressed in saffron robes, carrying bowls of blessed water and bundles of incense. They entered the assembly hall in silence, their faces calm but watchful. The ritual they performed was methodical and ancient, a series of chants and blessings meant to calm restless spirits and cleanse a space of negative energy. They walked the perimeter of the hall, sprinkling water onto the floors and walls, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic prayer. The ritual lasted for hours, and by the time the monks left just before dawn, they assured the school that the hall had been cleansed, that whatever presence had been disturbed had been calmed. Sister Agnes thanked them, exhausted and desperate to believe that the nightmare was over. But when the cleaning staff arrived at 6 a.m. to prepare the hall for the day, they found something that made them call the principal immediately. The floor, the polished teak floor that had been spotless the night before, was covered in long, deep scratch marks. The marks ran in parallel lines, as if something with claws had dragged itself across the entire length of the hall. The scratch marks were not shallow. They were deep enough that splinters of wood had been pulled up, leaving jagged grooves that ran from the back of the hall all the way to the stage. The cleaning staff stood at the entrance, refusing to step inside, their faces pale. When Sister Agnes arrived and saw the marks herself, she felt something inside her collapse. The monks had been there. The ritual had been performed. The hall had been locked. No one had entered after they left. And yet, something had moved across that floor during the night, something physical enough to leave marks that could not be ignored. She called the monks back immediately. This time, when they arrived and saw the scratches, their expressions shifted. The lead monk, an elderly man named Fra Somchai, knelt down and ran his fingers along one of the grooves. He remained silent for a long time, his eyes closed, his lips moving in quiet prayer. When he finally stood, he spoke to Sister Agnes in a low voice. He told her that the cleansing had worked, but that it had also revealed something the hall had been hiding for a very long time. He said that beneath the floor, something had been buried, something that had been forgotten or ignored, and that the prayers of the girls that morning had awakened it. He did not say what it was, He did not claim to know, but he said that the marks were a sign, a message, and that the school would need to decide whether to uncover what lay beneath or to seal the hall permanently. Sister Agnes felt the weight of that choice settle onto her shoulders like a stone. The school remained closed for the next 3 days. During that time, a decision was made by the board of directors, in consultation with local spiritual advisors and structural engineers, to examine the foundation beneath the assembly hall. It was a decision made out of desperation more than curiosity, because the alternative, leaving the hall as it was, felt impossible after what had been witnessed. The engineers arrived on the 4th day and began removing sections of the teak flooring near the center of the hall, where the scratch marks were deepest. What they found beneath the wood was a layer of concrete, and beneath that, a shallow space that had been filled in decades earlier. The space was not large, perhaps 2 meters by 3 meters, and it appeared to have been part of an older structure that predated the current school building. Inside the space, wrapped in rotting cloth, were bones. Human bones, small and fragile, belonging to what appeared to be a child. There were no records of any burial on the school grounds. No documentation of any construction that would have involved human remains. The bones were old, possibly decades old, but their presence was undeniable. When the discovery was made, the engineers stepped back, and the monks were called in once more. This time, they performed a full funeral rite, treating the remains with the reverence of a proper burial that had been denied. The bones were carefully removed, blessed, and taken to a temple where they would be cremated according to Buddhist tradition. The space beneath the hall was filled, the floor was rebuilt, and the hall was blessed again, this time with a ceremony that lasted an entire day. When the school reopened the following week, the girls returned to their routines. Morning prayers resumed in the assembly hall, though the atmosphere felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the room itself remembered what had happened. There were no more collapses, no more voices, no more scratch marks. But several of the girls who had been affected that October morning would later say that they still remembered the voices, not as something external, but as something that had spoken through them, something that had needed to be heard. Sister Agnes retired the following year. In interviews given years later, she would only say that the events of October 2003 had challenged everything she believed about the world, about the boundaries between the living and the dead, and about the places where those boundaries could be crossed. She never spoke in detail about the voices, or about the child whose bones had been found beneath the hall. But those who were there, the teachers, the students, the monks, they carried the memory with them, and some, late at night when the air felt heavy and still, would wonder if the child had finally found peace, or if the prayers that morning had only opened a door that was never meant to be closed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put process on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But that was not the only time in recent history when the boundary between the living and the dead seemed to blur in unsettling ways. Across the sea, in the coastal regions of Japan, something equally disturbing began to unfold in the aftermath of a disaster that had already claimed thousands of lives. It started quietly, with whispered reports from taxi drivers who worked the night shifts, men and women who thought they were simply picking up passengers in need of a ride. But what they encountered on those dark roads would haunt them for years to come, and it would reveal something about grief, loss, and the places where the dead linger when they cannot let go. On the afternoon of March 11th, 2011, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami that reached heights of over 40 meters in some areas. The wave swept inland with devastating force, obliterating entire towns, erasing neighborhoods, and claiming the lives of nearly 16,000 people. In the city of Ishinomaki, located in the Miyagi Prefecture near Fukushima, the destruction was absolute. Streets that had been filled with shops and homes were reduced to fields of rubble and debris. The coastline was reshaped, the landscape unrecognizable. In the months that followed, survivors returned to what remained of their towns, searching for bodies, for belongings, for any trace of the lives they had lost. The grief was immense, a weight that pressed down on the entire region. But amid the mourning and the slow, painful work of rebuilding, something else began to happen. Something that the survivors did not speak about openly at first. Something that emerged in the quiet hours after dark, when the roads were empty, and the only sound was the wind moving through the ruins. Taxi drivers in the area began to report strange encounters. It started with a driver named Takeshi Yamada, a man in his 50s who had driven taxis in Ishinomaki for over 20 years. Takeshi had survived the tsunami by fleeing inland, but his home had been destroyed, and he had returned to work as soon as the roads were cleared enough to allow traffic. He worked the night shift because the fares were better, because fewer drivers were willing to work after dark in a city that still felt haunted by what had happened. On a cold night in late April, just over a month after the disaster, Takeshi was parked near the remains of what had once been a busy shopping district. The area was dark, the streetlights still not functioning, and most of the buildings were either collapsed or marked for demolition. He was about to drive back toward the city center when he saw a figure standing on the corner, waving him down. It was a woman, middle-aged, wearing a dark coat and carrying a small purse. She looked ordinary, tired perhaps, but not distressed. Takeshi pulled over, and she climbed into the back seat without a word. When he asked her where she wanted to go, she gave him an address, speaking quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Takeshi recognized the address immediately. It was in a neighborhood that no longer existed, a cluster of homes that had been completely washed away by the tsunami. He hesitated, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed straight ahead. He asked her again, thinking perhaps he had misheard, but she repeated the address, her tone flat and emotionless. Takeshi did not know what to say. He considered telling her that the neighborhood was gone, that there was nothing there but debris, but something about the way she sat so still, so silent, made him uneasy. He started driving. As Takeshi navigated the dark streets, heading toward the coast, he kept glancing at the woman in the mirror. She had not moved since getting in. Her hands rested on her lap, her eyes staring forward, unblinking. The silence in the car felt heavy, oppressive, and Takeshi found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. He tried to make small talk, asking her if she was visiting family, if she needed help finding a shelter, but she did not respond. Her lips did not move. She did not even seem to acknowledge that he had spoken. The roads leading toward the coast were rough, still littered with debris that the cleanup crews had not yet reached. Takeshi drove slowly, his headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the skeletal remains of buildings and the twisted metal of cars that had been swept inland by the wave. When he reached the area where the address should have been, he stopped the car. There was nothing there. No homes, no street signs, just an empty expanse of mud and rubble stretching toward the black water of the ocean. He turned around to tell the woman that they had arrived, that there was nothing to see, but the back seat was empty. The woman was gone. The door had not opened. He had not heard any sound, but she was no longer there. Takeshi sat in the car for several minutes, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. He checked the doors, checked the locks, looked around the empty landscape outside, but there was no sign of her. He had driven her to the ruins of a neighborhood that no longer existed, and somewhere along the way, she had vanished. He drove back to the city center in a daze, unsure of what he had just experienced, unsure if he should even tell anyone. But when he returned to the taxi stand and spoke with other drivers, he found that he was not alone. 3 other drivers had reported similar encounters in the past 2 weeks. Passengers who appeared normal, who gave addresses in destroyed neighborhoods, who disappeared from the back seat without a sound. The stories were identical in their strangeness, and the drivers, all of them experienced men who had spent years navigating the streets of Ishinomaki, had no explanation for what was happening. They began calling the passengers the returners, spirits who seemed to be reliving their final journeys, unaware that they had already died. Over the following months, the reports multiplied. More than 30 taxi drivers in the Fukushima and Miyagi areas came forward with accounts of phantom passengers. The encounters followed a pattern. The passengers always appeared at night, always in areas near the coast, always requesting addresses in neighborhoods that had been destroyed. They were quiet, often staring straight ahead, and they always vanished before reaching their destination. Some drivers reported feeling an intense cold in the car during these rides, a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Others described a smell, faint but unmistakable, the smell of salt water and wet earth. A few said that they heard the passengers crying softly in the back seat, though when they looked in the mirror, the passengers' faces remained expressionless. The phenomenon became so common that drivers began refusing to pick up fares near the coastal ruins after dark. Some quit driving altogether, unable to shake the feeling that they were transporting the dead, that their cars had become vessels for the lost and the grieving. The local media eventually caught wind of the stories, and reporters began interviewing the drivers, documenting their accounts. But the reports were met with skepticism by some, dismissed as grief-induced hallucinations or elaborate hoaxes. Yet the consistency of the stories, the sincerity of the drivers, and the sheer number of encounters made it difficult to ignore. A sociology student from Tohoku University, named Yuka Kudo, became fascinated by the phenomenon and decided to conduct formal research on the encounters. She interviewed over 40 drivers, recording their stories, comparing the details, and analyzing the patterns. What she found was both unsettling and strangely moving. The passengers, described by the drivers, were almost always people who had lived in the destroyed areas, people who had likely died in the tsunami. The addresses they requested were real addresses, homes that had existed before the disaster. Yuka theorized that the spirits were not malicious, but rather caught in a kind of loop, repeating the journeys they had taken in life, unable to comprehend that those journeys could no longer be completed. She called it a collective haunting, a manifestation of trauma so profound that it had left an imprint on the landscape itself. Her research was published in a small academic journal, and later gained wider attention when it was picked up by national news outlets. The term ghost taxi encounters became shorthand for the phenomenon, and the stories spread beyond Japan, capturing the attention of paranormal researchers and skeptics alike. But for the drivers who had experienced the encounters firsthand, the attention felt hollow. They were not looking for fame or validation. They simply wanted the rides to stop. Takeshi Yamada, the driver who had been one of the first to report an encounter, eventually stopped working the night shift altogether. He moved his hours to the daytime, refusing to drive after sunset. In an interview conducted 2 years after his initial encounter, he described the experience as one of the most unsettling moments of his life, not because he felt threatened, but because of the sadness that seemed to emanate from the woman in his car. He said that he had spent years driving people to their destinations, helping them get where they needed to go, but that night He had been asked to take someone to a place that no longer existed, to fulfill a journey that could never be completed. He said that the feeling of helplessness, of knowing that the passenger would never find what she was looking for, haunted him more than the fact that she had vanished. Other drivers echoed similar sentiments. They spoke not of fear, but of sorrow, of the weight of carrying people who were already gone, of being caught between the living world and something else, something that refused to let go. The encounters continued sporadically for several years after the tsunami. By 2015, they had become less frequent, though they never stopped entirely. Some drivers reported that the passengers began to appear less solid, more translucent, as if they were fading over time. Others said that the requests became vaguer, the addresses less specific, as if the memories themselves were dissolving. A few drivers claimed that they no longer saw the passengers at all, but still felt the presence of someone in the back seat, a cold spot, a shift in the air. The phenomenon became part of the region's folklore, a ghost story rooted in real tragedy, a reminder of the thousands of lives lost and the grief that lingered in their absence. The taxi companies did not officially acknowledge the encounters, though some quietly advised their drivers to avoid certain routes at night. The survivors of the tsunami, many of whom had lost family members, had mixed reactions to the stories. Some found comfort in the idea that their loved ones were still present in some form, still trying to come home. Others found it unbearably sad, a sign that the dead were trapped, unable to move forward. And a few dismissed the stories entirely, seeing them as nothing more than urban legends born from collective trauma. But the drivers knew what they had experienced. They knew the weight of those silent passengers, the cold that seeped into their cars, the addresses that led to nothing but ruins. And some of them, late at night when the roads were empty and the ocean wind carried the smell of salt and wet earth, still wondered if the passengers had finally found their way home, or if they were still out there, still waving down cabs in the dark, still searching for places that no longer existed. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already carry the weight of inexplicable terror, what comes next descends into something even darker, something that blurs not just the line between life and death, but between reality and the nightmares that wait just beneath the surface of our everyday world. Because sometimes the most terrifying horror is not what happens after death, but what happens when the living encounter forces they were never meant to understand. In the summer of 1997, on a humid June night in Manila, a radio DJ named Carlos Mendoza sat alone in the booth of DWRT-FM, a small, independent station that broadcast from the third floor of a converted colonial building in the Malati district. It was just past midnight, and Carlos was midway through his late-night talk show, a program that mixed music requests with call-ins from insomniacs and night shift workers across the city. He was reading a dedication someone had phoned in when his producer, sitting in the adjacent control room, suddenly pressed the intercom button and asked Carlos if he heard it too. Carlos paused, confused, and asked what he was supposed to be hearing. The producer, a young man named Miguel, said there was a voice, a whisper, bleeding through behind Carlos's own voice on the broadcast. Carlos listened through his headphones, but heard nothing unusual. Miguel insisted it was there, faint but present, a female voice layered beneath the audio. Carlos shrugged it off, thinking it was interference or a technical glitch, and continued with the show. But over the next hour, 3 listeners called in to say the same thing. They could hear someone whispering behind Carlos, words they could not quite make out, but a voice that did not belong. DWRT-FM had operated out of the same building for nearly 15 years, a station known for its eclectic programming and its loyal audience of night owls who tuned in for companionship during the dark hours. The building itself was old, dating back to the early 1900s, with thick walls, high ceilings, and narrow staircases that creaked underfoot. The studio was small, just 2 rooms, the broadcast booth where the DJ sat, and the control room where the producer managed the soundboard and the phone lines. The walls were lined with foam padding to dampen echoes, and the single window in the booth looked out onto the empty street below. Carlos had worked the midnight shift for 3 years, and he knew the station intimately, every hum of the equipment, every shadow that the overhead lights cast. He was not a superstitious man. He believed in logic, in technical explanations, in the rational workings of sound waves and electrical circuits. So when the calls came in about the whisper, he dismissed them as listener paranoia, the kind of thing that happened when people sat alone in the dark, listening to disembodied voices through speakers. But Miguel, who had been working as a producer for only 6 months, seemed genuinely unsettled. He played back the recording of the last segment, and this time Carlos heard it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a whisper, rhythmic and deliberate, running beneath his own voice like a second track that had been mixed in at a barely audible volume. The words were unclear, distorted, but the presence of the voice was undeniable. Carlos felt a chill run through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He told Miguel to check the equipment, to make sure there was no interference from another frequency, no malfunction in the mixing board. Miguel spent the next 20 minutes running diagnostics while Carlos continued the show, but he found nothing wrong. The equipment was functioning perfectly. The whisper, whatever it was, had no technical explanation. Over the following weeks, the whisper became a regular occurrence. It did not happen every night, but often enough that both Carlos and Miguel began to expect it. Listeners started calling in specifically to ask about it, some intrigued, others disturbed. The whisper seemed to grow slightly louder with each appearance, as if it was gaining strength or confidence. Carlos would be mid-sentence, reading a news story or introducing a song, and the whisper would emerge, threading itself through his words. Miguel recorded every instance, building a collection of audio files that he would analyze after the show. He tried filtering the recordings, isolating frequencies, amplifying the whisper to see if he could make out what it was saying. For weeks, the words remained indistinct, garbled. But then one night, in late July, Miguel played back a recording and heard it clearly. The whisper, now loud enough to be understood, was saying the same phrase over and over. "I never left the studio." Carlos listened to the playback in silence, his face pale. The voice was female, soft but insistent, and the phrase was unmistakable. Miguel asked Carlos if he knew of anyone who had died in the building, any incidents or accidents that might explain the presence. Carlos said he had never heard of anything, but he promised to ask the station manager. The next day, Carlos approached the manager, an older man named Mr. Torres, who had run the station since its inception. When Carlos mentioned the whisper and the phrase it had spoken, Mr. Torres's expression darkened. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. He told Carlos that in 1983, a young woman named Elena Cruz had worked at the station as a late-night DJ. She had been talented, beloved by listeners, but she had struggled with depression. One night, after her shift ended, she had locked herself in the broadcast booth and taken her own life. Her body had been found the next morning by the cleaning staff. Mr. Torres said that the station had tried to move past the tragedy, that they had blessed the studio and continued operating, but there had always been rumors among the staff, small things, lights flickering, doors closing on their own, the feeling of being watched. He had never believed them, had always attributed them to imagination and grief. But now, hearing about the whisper, about the phrase, he could no longer dismiss it so easily. Carlos did not know what to do with this information. He considered quitting, walking away from the midnight shift and never returning, but something kept him there. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was the strange sense of responsibility he felt toward the voice, toward Elena, if that was truly who it was. He continued his shows, and the whisper continued to appear, now accompanied by other phenomena that Miguel documented meticulously. The temperature in the booth would drop suddenly, a cold that seemed to radiate from the walls. The on-air light, which was only supposed to illuminate when the microphone was active, began flickering on by itself at exactly 3 a.m, even when the studio was empty and locked. Miguel set up a camera to record the booth overnight, and when he reviewed the footage, he saw the light flicker on at 3 a.m. as expected. But he also saw something else. A figure, barely visible, standing in the corner of the booth. The figure was translucent, a silhouette of a woman in what appeared to be a light-colored dress. She stood motionless, facing the microphone, and after several seconds, she faded from view. Miguel showed the footage to Carlos, and for the first time, Carlos felt genuine fear. This was no longer just a voice on a recording. This was something that could be seen, something that occupied the same space where he sat every night. He asked Miguel to stop recording, to stop investigating, but Miguel was too invested. He wanted to understand, to document, to prove that what they were experiencing was real. He began researching Elena Cruz, finding old newspaper articles about her death, speaking to former staff members who remembered her. Everyone he spoke to described her the same way: talented, kind, but haunted by something she never spoke about openly. Her death had shocked everyone, and the station had never fully recovered from the loss. One night in early August, Carlos was alone in the booth during a live broadcast when the whisper returned. But this time, it was different. It was no longer faint or layered beneath his voice. It was loud, clear, and it was speaking directly into the microphone. Carlos froze, his hands hovering over the soundboard. The whisper said his name: Carlos. He looked up at the glass separating the booth from the control room, but Miguel was not there. Miguel had stepped out to get coffee, leaving Carlos alone. The whisper repeated his name, and Carlos felt the temperature in the room plummet. His breath came out in visible clouds. He could see frost forming on the edges of the microphone. The on-air light flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Carlos wanted to run, to leave the booth, and never come back, but his body would not move. He was paralyzed, not by fear exactly, but by something else, a presence that held him in place. The whisper spoke again, and this time, it said something that made Carlos's blood run cold. "Why won't you listen to me?" The voice was not angry. It was pleading, desperate, filled with a sadness so profound that Carlos felt it settle over him like a weight. He forced himself to speak, his voice shaking. He asked what she wanted, what she needed him to hear. There was silence, long and heavy, and then the whisper answered, "I never wanted to leave. I never wanted to be forgotten." The words hung in the air, and Carlos understood then that this was not about fear or haunting in the traditional sense. This was about grief, about a life that had ended too soon, about a person who had loved her work, her voice, her connection to the listeners, and who had been erased from the station's history in the wake of her death. Carlos, his voice steady now, spoke directly into the microphone. He said Elena's name. He told the listeners, whoever was tuned in at that moment, about the woman who had once sat in that very booth, who had brought comfort to people during the lonely hours of the night, who had been lost but was not gone. He said her name again, and the cold in the room began to lift. When Miguel returned, he found Carlos sitting in silence, staring at the microphone. The recording of that segment would later reveal something extraordinary. At the moment Carlos spoke Elena's name, the whisper responded one final time. It said, "Thank you," and then it was gone. The audio was clear, unmistakable, and it would become the most discussed recording in the station's history. Carlos continued to work at DWRT-FM for 2 more weeks, but the toll of the experience had worn him down. He quit in late August, telling Mr. Torres that he could no longer handle the midnight shift, that the weight of what he had experienced was too much to carry. Miguel stayed on, taking over as the primary producer for the late-night programs. He never heard the whisper again, but the on-air light continued to flicker on at 3 in the morning, a phenomenon that persisted for years. Some staff members would later say that they felt a presence in the booth, not threatening, but watchful, as if someone was still there, still listening. The station never officially acknowledged the haunting, but the story spread through Manila's radio community, and DWRT-FM became known as the station where the dead still had a voice. In interviews conducted years later, Carlos would say that he did not believe in ghosts before that summer, that he had always been skeptical of the supernatural. But after what he experienced, after hearing his name spoken by a voice that should not have existed, after feeling the cold and seeing the light flicker and speaking to someone who had been dead for over a decade, he could no longer deny that there were things in the world that defied explanation. He said that he still thought about Elena sometimes, wondered if she had found peace, if speaking her name had been enough. He did not know, but he hoped that wherever she was, she knew that she had not been forgotten, that her voice, in whatever form it took, had been heard. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But if you think the dead only haunt the places where they died, you would be wrong. Sometimes they find us in the spaces we move through, in the vehicles that carry us from one place to another, in the moments when we are most vulnerable and least prepared. And when that happens, when the boundaries collapse in the middle of an ordinary journey, the terror is not just in what we see or hear, but in the realization that there is nowhere to escape, nowhere to run, because the haunting is all around us, moving with us, breathing down our necks in the dark. On the night of September 14th, 2007, a bus departed from the northern city of Chiang Rai, bound for Bangkok, a journey that typically took around 12 hours along the winding roads that cut through the mountains and valleys of northern Thailand. The bus was operated by a small regional company, and it was one of the older models in their fleet, a vehicle that had been in service for over 15 years. The interior was worn but functional, with rows of blue fabric seats, overhead compartments for luggage, and windows that rattled slightly as the bus picked up speed. There were 23 passengers on board that night, a mix of locals returning home from visits to family, a few tourists, and several workers heading south for employment opportunities in the capital. The driver, a man named Somchai, had driven the route countless times and knew every curve, every hill, every place where the road narrowed and required extra caution. He was experienced, reliable, and well-liked by the passengers who recognized him from previous trips. The bus left the terminal just after 9 in the evening, and for the first few hours the ride was uneventful. Passengers dozed in their seats, some listened to music through headphones, others stared out the windows at the darkness beyond, watching the occasional cluster of lights from a village pass by. Around midnight, As the bus climbed into the higher elevations where the air grew cooler and the road became more isolated, something began to change. Several passengers later reported feeling a sudden drop in temperature inside the bus, a cold that seemed to seep in from nowhere. It was not the kind of cold that came from the air conditioning, which was barely functioning, but a deeper, more penetrating chill that made people pull their jackets tighter and rub their arms for warmth. One passenger, a young woman named Noi, mentioned to the person sitting next to her that she could see her breath, that the air inside the bus had become visible in the way it does on a freezing winter morning. But it was September, and even at this elevation, the temperature should not have dropped so drastically. Noi's seatmate, an older man named Precha, nodded in agreement. He said that he had felt the cold, too, and that it had come on suddenly, as if something had opened a door and let the chill pour in. Other passengers began to murmur, shifting in their seats, looking around to see if others were experiencing the same thing. Somchai, the driver, noticed the discomfort through his rearview mirror and assumed it was just the mountain air. He turned up the heater, but the cold persisted, and within minutes, something far worse began to happen. A man sitting near the back of the bus, a construction worker in his 30s, named Lek, suddenly let out a loud, guttural scream that echoed through the enclosed space. Passengers turned to see him convulsing in his seat, his body jerking violently, his head thrown back, his eyes rolled up so that only the whites were visible. The woman sitting across from him scrambled out of her seat, pressing herself against the window, her face pale with fear. Lek's mouth was open, but the sounds coming from him were not his own. They were deep, resonant, layered with multiple tones, as if several voices were speaking through him at once. The words were in Thai, but the phrasing was old, archaic, the kind of language that had not been spoken commonly in decades. Before anyone could process what was happening to Lek, another passenger, a teenage girl named Ploy, began to scream as well. Her body went rigid, her hands clawing at the seat in front of her, her eyes rolling back just like Lek's. The voices that emerged from her were different, higher pitched, but equally unnatural. Within seconds, 2 more passengers collapsed into the same state, their bodies convulsing, their voices chanting in unison, words that none of the conscious passengers could fully understand. Somchai, hearing the chaos erupting behind him, pulled the bus over to the side of the road, his hands shaking as he engaged the brake. He turned on the interior lights and stood up, looking back at the scene unfolding in the aisle. What he saw made him freeze. A thin mist, gray and cold, was drifting through the bus, moving slowly from the back toward the front. It had no visible source, no logical explanation, and it seemed to flow like water, pooling in the aisle and rising in tendrils that reached toward the ceiling. The passengers who were still conscious backed away from it, some pressing themselves against the windows, others climbing over seats to get further to the mist. The 4 who were convulsing continued to chant, their voices growing louder, overlapping, creating a sound that was both terrifying and hypnotic. Somchai did not know what to do. He had driven this route for over 20 years, and nothing like this had ever happened. He stepped into the aisle, moving cautiously toward the affected passengers, but as he got closer, he felt the cold intensify, felt it wrap around him like a physical force. One of the passengers, a man named Wit, who had been sitting near the front, shouted at Somchai to call for help, to get someone, anyone, to stop whatever was happening. Somchai pulled out his phone, but there was no signal. They were too far into the mountains, too isolated. He ran back to the driver's seat and tried the radio, but it was filled with static. The mist continued to spread, and more passengers began to show signs of distress. A woman near the middle of the bus started sobbing uncontrollably. her hands pressed to her head as if trying to block out a sound only she could hear. A young man began laughing, a high, manic sound that did not match the terror in his eyes. The bus had descended into chaos, and Somchai, desperate, made the decision to drive. He thought that if he could get them out of this area, if he could bring them to a town or a police station, someone could help. He started the engine and pulled back onto the road, driving faster than he normally would, his eyes darting between the road ahead and the nightmare unfolding behind him. But as he drove, the chanting grew louder, and the mist thickened. It was no longer confined to the aisle. It filled the entire bus, obscuring visibility, turning the interior into a cold gray fog. Somchai could barely see the passengers now, could only hear their voices, the screams, the chanting, the sobbing, all blending into a cacophony that made it hard to think. He pressed harder on the accelerator, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, praying that they would reach help before something worse happened. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 20 minutes, Somchai saw lights ahead. A small village, a cluster of buildings, and a roadside temple. He pulled the bus into the temple's parking area, slamming on the brakes and throwing the door open. He stumbled out, shouting for help, and within moments, monks and villagers emerged from the temple, drawn by the noise. When they approached the bus and saw the mist pouring out of the open door, several of them stepped back, their faces filled with recognition and fear. One of the older monks, a man with a lined face and calm eyes, immediately began chanting, his voice steady and authoritative. He signaled for the other monks to join him, and together they approached the bus, their voices rising in prayer. The conscious passengers stumbled out, gasping for air, their clothes damp with condensation from the mist. The 4 who had been convulsing were carried out, still, unconscious, their bodies limp. The monks surrounded them, continuing their chants, and slowly, gradually, the mist inside the bus began to dissipate. The cold lifted, and the air inside the vehicle returned to normal. The convulsing passengers began to wake, their eyes fluttering open, confusion replacing the blankness that had been there before. They had no memory of what had happened, no recollection of the voices or the chanting. They only knew that they felt exhausted, drained, as if something had been pulled from them. The villagers, once the immediate crisis had passed, told Somchai and the passengers what they already suspected. The road they had been traveling on passed directly over land that had a dark history. Decades earlier, during a period of civil unrest and political violence in the region, dozens of people had been killed and buried in unmarked graves near the roadside. The exact locations of the graves had never been officially documented, and over the years the area had developed a reputation for strange occurrences. Drivers reported seeing figures standing on the roadside at night, figures that vanished when approached. There were stories of vehicles breaking down for no reason, of passengers falling ill, of a persistent cold that seemed to cling to anyone who passed through after dark. The monks explained that the spirits of those who had been buried without proper rites often lingered, restless and unable to move on. They said that the bus had likely disturbed something, that the presence of so many living people passing through had attracted the attention of the dead, who had tried to make themselves known in the only way they could. The monks performed a full blessing on the bus, walking through the interior with incense and holy water, chanting prayers meant to guide the spirits away and protect the passengers. They advised Somchai to take a different route back, to avoid the area entirely, and to have the bus cleansed more thoroughly. When he returned to Chiang Rai, Somchai did as they suggested. He drove the remaining passengers to Bangkok using an alternate route, one that added several hours to the journey but kept them far from the site of the encounter. When he returned to the bus company and reported what had happened, the owners were skeptical at first, but when they heard the accounts from the passengers, When they saw the recorded footage from the bus's security camera showing the mist and the convulsing passengers, they could not deny that something extraordinary had occurred. The bus was taken out of service immediately. It was blessed by multiple monks, cleansed repeatedly, but the company decided that it was no longer safe to use. The vehicle was quietly retired, parked in a back lot, and eventually sold for scrap. But the story did not end there. In the months and years that followed, passengers on other buses traveling the same route at night began to report similar experiences. The cold, the mist, the feeling of being watched. Some claimed to hear chanting coming from the empty seats, voices that seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with the movement of the bus. Drivers began to avoid the route after midnight, and the company eventually rerouted their nighttime schedules to bypass the area entirely. The local community, aware of the history and the persistent reports, began referring to the stretch of road as the Haunted Highway, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin, where the past refused to stay buried. Years later, a journalist investigating the phenomenon interviewed several of the passengers who had been on the bus that night. Most were reluctant to speak in detail, the memory still too unsettling, but a few shared their experiences. Noi, the young woman who had first noticed the cold, said that she still could not travel by bus at night without feeling anxious, without remembering the mist and the voices. Lek, the construction worker who had been one of the first to convulse, said that he had no memory of the incident itself, but that he had woken up with bruises on his arms and a sense of profound exhaustion that lasted for weeks. Ploy, the teenage girl, said that sometimes, late at night, she would hear the chanting in her dreams, and she would wake up feeling as though someone had been speaking through her, using her voice to say things she did not understand. The journalist also spoke to the monks who had performed the cleansing, and they confirmed that the area was known to be spiritually troubled, that the unmarked graves had never been properly addressed, and that until those who were buried there received the rites they deserved, the disturbances would likely continue. They said that the bus, in passing through, had become a vessel, a temporary home for spirits seeking acknowledgement, seeking to be heard. The monks did not claim to have solved the problem permanently. They had only calmed the spirits for a time, offered them temporary peace. But peace, they said, could not be permanent until the truth of what had happened in that place was fully acknowledged, until the dead were honored and their suffering recognized. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.